In part two of our lecture, we transition to Native American literature. So Native American literature has taken on a real prominent role in the stage of modern literature in the latter half of the 20th century as more Native American writers have emerged and given us some great stories. Much like the Latin American literary movement we studied in the part one of this lecture, the voices of the Native American people were silenced for a long time by colonization, forced relocation, etc. I'm sure you're familiar with the history of the U.S., and so there's a lot of parallels and similarities between the history of Latin American and Native American literature, with the emphasis on the rich oral tradition of the indigenous people, that tradition having been silenced. Modern writers emerging in the latter half of the 20th century, gaining much deserved critical attention and incorporating aspects of those indigenous legends and stories into their very modern writing, in bringing the stories of their people to the forefront. So it's wonderful we have the opportunity to look at one of the most well-known pieces of Native American literature here with Leslie Marmon Silko's Yellow Woman. And a real quick note that there's an interesting element to reading Native American literature that makes it seem like you're definitely reading world literature. It feels like you're reading something from Asia or Africa or Latin America, with many of the literary techniques and other things you see, because the cultural experiences were so similar, yet geographically speaking, we're in the U.S. So I would encourage you, as you read and as you listen to the lecture, try not to think of this as an example of literature from the U.S., but as an example of world literature. As I pointed out, Native American literature has a very important role on the global stage. And if we were to overlook it and not study a piece of Native American literature in this course, we'd be making a major misstep. And also, like I said a few minutes ago, I should mention that the Native American literature had a boom or a renaissance in the latter half of the 20th century, much as Latin American literature did. And so Leslie Marmon Silko was probably the most well-known, most accomplished author of the Native American literary movement, as Gabriel Garcia Marquez is of the Latin American one. So let's learn about her. She was born in Albuquerque, but did not live there very long. She spent most of her life growing up in the Laguna Pueblo area where her tribe is located. So she's of mixed race ancestry. Only one of her parents is from the Laguna Pueblo tribe, but she says, "What I know is Laguna." So the tribe of her people, even though she has mixed parentage, is really the identity she has embraced. And her tribe is probably a lesser-known tribe. It's not a tribe you would study in like a history class. But, she is at the forefront, like I said, of the Native American literature renaissance. And her tribe has a very interesting history. They did not really have contact with white settlers until the 19th century, so later than a lot of the other tribes. But two white brothers, Robert and Walter Marmon, came to Laguna Pueblo in the 19th century. They wrote a constitution for the Laguna Pueblo people, and each served a term as a governor of the tribe and also married Laguna women. And so this is a really interesting history. Reading this and reviewing this context, I've taught this story a few times, but reviewing Silko's context to compose this lecture, I was struck by the notion that I should learn more about the Laguna Pueblo people. So much of the history of the interaction between white settlers and Native American people is so violent, and even when it's not overtly violent, there's this cultural hegemony of white people basically manipulating circumstances to steal land. And this little snippet, this paragraph here we have that the Norton editors devote to Silko's background, it doesn't tell us much, but it sounds like this was a fairly peaceful interaction. And I don't know how much these brothers truly helped the Laguna Pueblo people and how much they just tried to culturally assimilate them to Western values. I'm not sure. But it's something interesting I want to learn more about. And it happened very recently. I mean, Silko is older now, toward the end of her life, but still alive and with us. And Robert Marmon, one of the two brothers who came and helped the tribe modernize, is Silko's great-grandfather. That's why her name is Leslie Marmon Silko. So really interesting history there of her tribe. And then let's learn more about her. So from 1964 to 1969, she attended the University of New Mexico, where she studied English. During that time, she got married. She had the first of her two children, and she published her first short story. After undergrad, she intended to go into law. She studied in what is called the American Indian Law Program at the University of New Mexico because her goal was to work in the legal area of native land claims. But in 1971, so 2 years after she finished her undergrad, she became aware of the National Endowment for the Arts Discovery Grant. And this really showed to her that with a grant or something like this, she could have the opportunity to the financial stability to write. And writing was her true passion. Like I said, she'd already published a short story. So in 1971, she turned her focus from the law to literature. And it didn't take her long to find her voice and have success. As early as 1974, she published her first short story collection just 3 years after she turned to writing full-time, and that collection includes Yellow Woman, which is a really well-known story to which scholars and critics have paid much attention. An entire volume of essays just on Yellow Woman was published in 1993, so it's a really well-received story to which scholars have devoted much time. And so she became accomplished right away. And if you choose to write on this story for your paper, you should definitely find that collection of essays. I'm sure our library has it or could get it for you through interlibrary loan. And she continued to just develop as a writer. Her first full-length and probably most well-known novel, Ceremony, came out in 1977. I'd highly recommend you read it. This is probably a text I would choose if we were to do what I said and have this be a 10-week class and go more in depth and read 7 or 8 novels. That would probably be on the list. So it's right up there with Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude in terms of its monumental impact on world literature. And the thing about this novel is incredibly complex. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, reading Native American literature is much more like reading world literature rather than U.S. literature, even though the geographical setting is the U.S. And an example of that is Ceremony, because when you read Ceremony, the events do not happen in chronological order. They happen out of sequence. So it's a challenging, complex, demanding novel to read, but well worth it. And what that really shows is a uniquely Native American experience. It illustrates that Native Americans, in many of their cultures, experience time differently than people from the western part of the world. And so that's that kind of jarring experience one has while reading that I've tried to point out multiple times is really the goal for us to have that kind of experience in this class. The novel was so successful that and so well received by scholars that she was awarded the MacArthur Fellowship Grant in 1981, just 4 years later, based on the success of Ceremony. And this award is called the Genius Grant. So very impressive. The only novel of hers that rivals Ceremony is Almanac of the Dead, which she published in 1991. Those are her two best novels, and I would probably have a hard time deciding between the two of them if I was going to pick just one for a world literature class where we read 7 or 8 novels in 10 weeks. But the thing about Almanac of the Dead is the tone is very different from Ceremony or Yellow Woman. As our anthology points out, Yellow Woman, Ceremony, and other works like them of Silko's have a fairly optimistic or helpful tone with a theme being healing. And so on the one hand, Silko is very clear that the Native American people need healing, and she provides kind of opportunities or ways to see how that's possible through her literature. But on the other side of the spectrum, after acknowledging that healing is necessary, the unrestrained violence that was wrought upon the Native American population, by the U.S. and other imperial powers is, unforgivable. And she even says that they deserve all of their land back. And so the Almanac of the Dead, as you can probably tell by its title, has a much more pessimistic tone. But I think this really shows how well-rounded she is, and how through her entire body of work, she really represents the Native American position fully and thoroughly. And like any culture, it's a highly nuanced one. As I mentioned, I think she's the first author we've looked at moving forward chronologically who's still alive today. So she was a professor at the University of Arizona for a long time and still lives there in Tucson, Arizona, where she lives, and continues to write and give the world the gifts of her stories. Let's take a look at this one. And before we do that, we should look at the legend that inspired it. So I mentioned in the last portion of the lecture when we were studying Gabriel Garcia Marquez that his works were often influenced by the legends and stories from the Latin American folklore of Colombia. And you see something very similar here with Native American literature. But in this case, whereas the story we had as an example in the textbook from Garcia Marquez was kind of a break from what he usually does, this is a full-on example of the indigenous native legend really impacting and influencing the piece of literature under study. And so we need to really understand the Yellow Woman legend and what it was. Most people aren't familiar with Yellow Woman because, like I said, the Laguna Pueblo tribe is a smaller tribe that, isn't studied as often outside of literature classes, because Leslie Mormon Silko is, easily the most well-known and accomplished Laguna Pueblo person. So the Yellow Woman is much more ubiquitous in Laguna culture than in, any other context. So, some figures from Native American literature, such as Coyote, are pretty well known outside of Native American literature, but the Yellow Woman is, you could argue, probably as prominent in Laguna literature as Coyote is in other literature, although she has a very different role. I'm just kind of illustrating how frequently that character appears in the legends of a specific tribe through a comparison to a more well-known character, if that makes sense. So because she's so ubiquitous in Laguna lore, she appears in multiple roles, not just one role. So first, as background and context, we'll look at what some of those roles were, and then we'll look at the most common role, because that is the one Silko adapts for her story. So some other examples that don't show up in the story but are still important to know as we become more well-rounded in our study of other cultures is that she was often a corn spirit. And so there was a blue woman, a red woman, and a white woman who would accompany Yellow Woman, because those are the four colors of corn. In Laguna lore, she eventually became a kind of every woman. As I said, she was very ubiquitous. So she comes to represent the common experience of Laguna women as she circulates in different stories from their oral traditions, if that makes sense. And so this is something Silko definitely draws on, because with the narrator here, we have an every woman, a common modern woman, and the Yellow Woman of legend is embodying her experiences, you could say. One other example is, and this is kind of an example of how she's an every woman, is there's a traditional Laguna prayer song. They often sing at naming ceremonies for newborn baby daughters, and they say, "Yellow woman is born, yellow woman is born." So these are some examples from the culture of how the Yellow Woman shows up. But the most common narrative follows a similar pattern with 3 plot points. And this is the narrative that Silko adapts for her story. And when I say adapts, that's an important term I'm using very intentionally. As the story tells us, the narrator tells us, her grandfather would tell her stories of Yellow Woman growing up. And so it's not like there's one Yellow Woman story. There's dozens, probably hundreds or even thousands of stories. And so, growing up in Laguna Pueblo, Silco and other people like her would hear these stories. And so the plot structure I'm about to outline is a very generic one that could be adapted and changed. And that's what storytellers would do. That's part of how oral storytelling works is you have kind of some common elements you don't change. And then beyond that, the story is very fluid, so the storyteller can manipulate it as they like. So in giving her own take, her own version of the common generic plot, Silco is entering into that tradition of storytelling, but she's doing it in a modern short story collection with an international audience. And so that's a way she kind of builds a bridge between past and present for her people through literature. An analogy that's very different but might kind of illustrate what I'm talking about is the adaptation of comic books into films. If you take a comic book character, say like Wolverine or Spider-Man or Captain America, there are certain aspects of their character and the narrative that accompanies their character that would be considered almost, you could say, sacrilegious by fans of the character in the comics if the filmmakers change those basic elements. But beyond those basic elements, they constantly change the story, and each filmmaker or writer or comic writer kind of gives a different spin on it. So that's a very different thing, obviously, from oral Native American folklore, but I'm trying to give an example to illustrate how this kind of general plot I'm about to overview would be adapted by each speaker without changing the fundamental elements. So let's look at those fundamental elements of the most common Yellow Woman narrative. She's abducted by a strange man who is usually a kachina, which is an ancestral spirit, while at a stream getting water. Her captor, the kachina, carries her off to another world. And then she returns home imbued with power that proves of value for her people. So this is a very common trope in literatures all throughout the world. You can see, if you've ever studied Joseph Campbell's A Hero with a Thousand Faces, and his argument that every character in every culture goes on a similar hero's journey, this is very much a hero's journey, leaving the primary world, going to a secondary or other world, coming back with some kind of power that helps her people. And then one key thing here is this man, this kachina, the spirit, abducts her. So now let's consider what themes we should look at as we explore Silco's unique version of the story. Probably the most important one is past and present. This is, like I said, really similar to what Garcia Marquez would typically do in his stories. So she draws on the traditions of her people, but also shows the influence of modernity on Native society. So there's that tension we see, similar to how the tension we saw in Gabriel Garcia Marquez, where you have like these past traditions, this community that compared to the world around it is very much a pre-modern type of community, but it's struggling with the transition to modernity. And so the writer wants to kind of draw on those traditions, those legends, those oral folk tales, and integrate them because they want that rich cultural history that's been silenced by empire for centuries to once again thrive. But then they're doing that in a modern context, which complicates everything. To go along with this, there's a distorted perception of reality. Interpreting the events of the story can be difficult, as they often blur the line between illusion and reality, or fail to take place in a chronological sequence. This illustrates the difference between Western and Native perceptions. So, again, like Garcia Marquez, it seems like a real village. You have an objective narrator, but he uses the term illusory to describe the village. We don't know what's really happening here. Has she really been abducted by this man? And what is the point of making just the basic plots of the story difficult to interpret? I mean, think about this for a second. If someone asked you to paraphrase Flaubert's Un Cours Simple, you could do that very easily because it's a very realist story. It's a classically realist story. Here, if someone asks you to summarize the events, even though probably less happens in the story, could you? How easy would that be for you to do? Think about that for a second. And why would the author want you to have difficulty even grasping the basics of the plot of what's going on? What illustrates the differences between Western and Native perceptions? Again, reading Native American literature is more like reading Asian or Latin American literature than it is like reading Western literature. And so the differences between the Native American culture and other cultures, the writers want those differences to be really clear. Like I said, in her famous novel Ceremony, the events take place out of chronological sequence. And you don't have quite that degree of difficulty here in reading this, but you definitely have shades of that. So it's important to note. Finally, our third theme we're going to look at as we read is ambiguity. So readers can interpret the ending, really I mean to say that the entire story, in multiple ways. And so really there's two ways to interpret the story. There's kind of a mythical, magical way to interpret it, which would be that the narrator is actually Yellow Woman and she actually lives out that story. She actually, is abducted by a Kachina and spends time with him before going back to her people. Or you can interpret it in a more modern way, which is that she is just a regular, ordinary woman abducted by a man. She's kind of drawn to him, even though he abducted her. She feels attracted to him, so she stays with him before she eventually has the opportunity to go back. And, she's an ordinary woman and he's a man named Silva, rather than her being Yellow Woman and him being Kachina. So those are the two ways to interpret the story. Which one is the correct one? If you don't have an answer to the question I just asked, which way to interpret is the correct way, then you've achieved exactly what Silko wants you to achieve. She wants it to be ambiguous. She doesn't want the clear interpretation. She doesn't want there to be a clear interpretation. She wants to distort reality. She wants to blur past and present. And so if this is the case, what should be kind of our guiding question as we read? As you've seen, I like to have a guiding question as we go. So to what degree does she integrate the Yellow Woman legend into her modern life? In other words, what extent does the influence of the past have on the present? Because this is all about the transition to modernity, right? How does a culture that is so different from the Western geographical space it occupies and it's been forced into modernity by imperialists, how does that culture find a way to thrive? There has to be some kind of balance between past and present is most likely the answer to that question. So what is that balance? To what degree is it past? To what degree is it modern or present? And so I think Silko tries to answer that question by showing us the experiences of the narrator here. And is she the same woman at the end of the text as the beginning? Well, we don't really know what she was like before, but we can see how whether she's literally the Yellow Woman or not, and just kind of figuratively experiences some of those things, we can see at the end of what degree the Yellow Woman legend has influenced her, perhaps more than before this experience with Kachina/Silva. So let's take a look as we try to answer that question. One thing I need to point out as we actually move through the story now is that it's separated into three parts. She wants to be ambiguous, so she doesn't number them 1, 2, 3, but there are clear line breaks. And as we mentioned, there's three clear plot points to the Yellow Woman legend, right? The abduction, the other world, and the return. So we'll move through those here. But when she's first with him, she has this interesting moment that brings our theme, our thread of past and present to the forefront, where she contemplates. It's really interesting. I think it's one of the most interesting passages in the story because she contemplates what was the experiences of being part of a legend actually like for the real Yellow Woman if there was a real Yellow Woman. So in her first person narration, she wonders if Yellow Woman had known who she was, if she knew that she would become part of the stories, maybe she had another name that her husband and relatives called her so that only the Kachina from the north and the storytellers would know her as Yellow Woman. This is really important. It's a reimagining of the legend with modern considerations, right? Rather than just being a figure in the story, she wonders, what was Yellow Woman like? Does she know she's a figure in the story? And so you have a really kind of modern, self-reflective perspective here that wants to take time to pay attention to the woman's role and not just treat her as a character in the story, but treat her as a real human person, which is a fascinating way, an important way in a modern context to reimagine the legend. And then there's another important element here, which is she considers that the Yellow Woman may have occupied a similar role to the one she herself is occupying right now. Maybe she'd had another name. This unnamed narrator has a real name, I'm assuming, that her husband, this narrator's married, and relatives, she lives with her parents and her grandparents, called her so that only the Kachina from the north and the storytellers would know her as Yellow Woman. So she's basically here entertaining the possibility that she actually could be Yellow Woman by saying maybe the Yellow Woman of legend is a similar thing to me. She was an ordinary woman who stepped into the role. Well, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought there for a minute. So what I was saying is that, she is, an ordinary woman, and every woman with a name and a family who, all of a sudden is living an existence very similar to Yellow Woman. So she's speculating maybe the Yellow Woman of legend also had those alternate identities. And what's important about this is she's considering, well, maybe I really could be Yellow Woman, because as I mentioned, this story is fluid between past and present, pre-modern, modern, illusion and reality, and so we don't really know if she's just an ordinary woman narrator or Yellow Woman. And so here in this moment, she herself is believing she could be Yellow Woman. All right, so part of that slippage between past, present, pre-modern, modern, illusion, reality is the distorted perception of reality. We, the reader, don't always know exactly what's going on, and neither do the characters. And that illustrates the ambiguity of the Native American experience. And so we have a passage here that reflects that. I will see someone, eventually I will see someone, and then I will be certain that he is only a man, some man from nearby, and I will be sure that I am not Yellow Woman, because she is from out of time past, and I live now, and I have been to school, and there are highways and pickup trucks that Yellow Woman never saw. So a few things are happening here. There's the blending of all of these binaries, kind of collapsing those binaries by showing they overlap. Past and present, pre-modern and modernity, illusion and reality. So Yellow Woman, according to the narrator, never saw pickup trucks or schools or highways. So Yellow Woman is clearly a figure representative of the past. And so that's kind of one thing going on here, is the intermingling of these binaries. The other thing is her further questioning of, am I really Yellow Woman, or am I just an ordinary woman with an ordinary man right now? And so the important thing here is I will see someone. Eventually I will see someone, and then I will be certain that he is only a man, some man from nearby, and I will be sure that I am not Yellow Woman. So in the Yellow Woman legend, when Kachina abducts Yellow Woman and takes her to the other world, they are isolated there, which means if she sees another human person, especially a human person representative of modernity, like a modern human person like her, then she'll know this is all real and not legend. She'll know she's not Yellow Woman. She'll know this is just some guy named Silva and not a Kachina. So the appearance of like another modern person would basically disrupt this kind of fantasy world they're living in. That's really important to keep in mind as the narrative progresses and we consider that question of which way are we interpreting this, the fantastical or the real way. All right, so one thing I want to look at here before we wrap up is the way this story mirrors the Yellow Woman legend. So remember, there's those 3 plot points from the Yellow Woman legend: abduction, otherworld, return to the primary world with ability to help people. So Silva's stone house, although it seems like a very humble, native structure, is representative of that other world from the Yellow Woman legend. And there's a day where he's gone for a while, and she tries to leave, but she falls asleep and then wanders around. And instead of going home, she comes back. She says, "It was noon when I got back. When I saw the stone house, I remembered that I had meant to go home, but that didn't seem important anymore because there were little blue flowers growing in the meadow behind the stone house, and the gray squirrels were playing in the pines next to the house." So, it's this other world. It's just a stone house, but even the gray squirrels and the pines make it like this special, isolated place. It feels special and fantastical within the world of the story. There's no one else there. Almost like a Edenic kind of escape to the past. The kind of rural space that the village and Death Constant Beyond Love doesn't provide. This is more like that Edenic escape, like the other world of Yellow Woman legend. But there's a few things from here we should consider that I haven't said yet. That Silva or Kachina seems to have a hold over her because she can't leave. This again seems to indicate maybe she is Yellow Woman, because that would be what was happening. If he was an ordinary guy, why couldn't she just walk away? Why would she somehow only find her way back there when she tries to walk away? So again, reality is distorted. This doesn't feel all the way real here. Why can't she leave? If it were all the way real, she'd be able to leave. So we've got the 2 main plot points of the Yellow Woman narrative established. She is abducted and leaves the regular world. She's now living in the secondary world. Eventually, she returns to the primary world. So what precipitates that return? And I didn't pull a quote for this, but basically, after she tries to leave but ends up staying in the passage we just read, she interacts with Silva or Kachina again, and, he has some meat to take to market to sell, so she goes with him. And he's confronted by, I don't know if it's a policeman or what, some kind of white person. They're having a disagreement. And there's some interesting interactions there of, he's speaking in a native language and the white person doesn't understand it. If we had more time, it would be interesting to pull on those threads and look at those passages. But eventually it sounds like he kills the guy. She runs off, and before she's fully away from the scene, she can't see anymore, but she's still close enough she can hear 4 gunshots. And so I think an easy way to interpret this passage would be to say that she leaves and goes home and returns to the primary world because of the violence here. She's had this tension the whole story of she's drawn to this guy, she's attracted to him, but he seems kind of aggressive. He has this hold over her that's a little unsettling. Like, maybe she shouldn't fully trust this guy, so she's struggled with that tension the whole story, but hasn't been strong enough to leave yet. Maybe actual violence, him killing someone, is what pushes her away. That'd be one way to interpret it, but there's another way. Remember, she acknowledged earlier in her reflections on the Yellow Woman legend that if another person appeared, that would disrupt the narrative fantasy of this being a legendary world and show her, no, there are other people here. I'm not isolated the way Yellow Woman is isolated with Kachina. And so she sees a very modern person here, a white person, not a native person. And so this must I think she's finally free and able to walk home then, because she's, sees this other person that kind of shocks her out of the fantasy world. And so that's the question I pose to you. I mean, that's one way to interpret it, but there are two ways to interpret it. So I definitely want to read about how you interpret it. All right, so we're going to look at one more passage and kind of wrap up here with a thesis. The thread number 3, ambiguity, we haven't looked at yet. I think the last passage in the story really addresses that, and that will push us to our thesis. But remember the question with ambiguity. Two things with ambiguity. One, Silko wants ambiguity. She doesn't want the answers to be clear. Two, the question is, which way do we interpret the story? Fantastical in pre-modern, or realistic in modern? So is the narrator actually the yellow woman living out the narrative of the legend? Or is she a modern woman abducted by a regular man but slightly drawn to him and thus, not really ready to leave until he's distracted by this conflict with another man? So the final paragraph is where she returns home to the primary world. And she says, I followed the path up from the river into the village. The sun was getting low, and I could smell supper cooking when I got to the screen door of my house. I could hear their voices inside. My mother was telling my grandmother how to fix the jello when my husband, Al, was playing with the baby. I decided to tell them that some Navajo had kidnapped me, but I was sorry that old grandpa wasn't alive to hear my story, because there was the yellow woman stories he liked to tell best. So this is clearly a very modern setting, Jello. It's like the strawberry soda in Death Constant Beyond Love. It really roots the story in the modern world. But she also says, I was sorry that old grandpa wasn't alive to hear my story, because it was the yellow woman stories he liked to tell best. So, even if we interpret this the second of the two ways, as this is just an ordinary story, she's not actually Yellow Woman. Even if we interpret it that way, her story still mirrors the Yellow Woman's. It still follows those events. Again, we don't really know to what degree she embraced, the native oral traditions before this experience, but we know perhaps to what degree she does now. And that's what's important, because she says, I was sorry that old grandpa wasn't alive to hear my story, because the yellow woman stories I like to tell best. So she would have looked forward to telling old grandpa this story that resembles the old, from the past stories he liked to tell. And so I think what we see here is a bridge between past and present, a degree to which the stories of the past should influence the struggles, the lives, the events of the present. These stories are important. We need to keep them around, but we also have to walk forward in modernity. And so, in the Yellow Woman legend, which the plot points here, whether or not she's really a Yellow Woman, her story mirrors that story, especially in the narrative structure. So that third plot point is returning, not just returning, but returning with a power to help her people. And this narrator, just like Yellow Woman, is returning with a power, a new understanding of the importance of the stories of the past to influence her people for the better, to build that bridge from past to present, from pre-modern to modernity. So I'll sum up my thoughts here with this thesis. This final passage would seem to indicate that the second possibility is more accurate, but the modern woman's narrative mirrors the yellow woman's narrative. She returns able to help her people as a bridge between the past and present.